The screaming had stopped 3 days ago in downtown Chicago, replaced by an eerie silence that made Zephyr Caldwell's skin crawl as she peered through the cracked window of the abandoned laboratory. Where once the streets bustled with life, now only shambling figures moved with jerky, unnatural gaits, their flesh mottled and gray, their eyes vacant pools of hunger. The plague had swept through the city faster than anyone could have predicted, transforming millions into something that existed in the space between life and death. Zephyr pulled her dark hair back into a tight ponytail and checked her watch, 2:47 p.m. She had been holed up in the Centers for Disease Control field office for 6 days now, surviving on vending machine snacks and bottled water while trying to make sense of the biological impossibility unfolding outside. As a virologist, she understood pathogens, mutations, and cellular death, but this defied every principle she had learned in her 15 years of research. The infected didn't simply die and decompose, they continued moving, driven by some primal urge to spread their condition to others. Her radio crackled to life, causing her to jump. "This is Nix Ravencroft, former Colonel, 82nd Airborne Division. If anyone is receiving this transmission, I'm establishing a safe zone at Millennium Park's underground parking structure. I have supplies, weapons, and a plan. Respond if you're alive and uninfected." Zephyr grabbed the radio with trembling hands. She hadn't heard another human voice in 2 days. "This is Dr. Zephyr Caldwell, CDC researcher. I'm approximately 8 blocks from your position. I have medical supplies and knowledge about the outbreak." "Copy that, Doctor. Can you make it here safely? The streets are crawling with infected, but if you stick to the subway tunnels, you might have a chance." Zephyr looked around the laboratory one last time, gathering her research notes, sample vials, and the portable testing equipment she had managed to salvage. If there was any hope of understanding this plague, she needed to preserve what little data she had collected. More importantly, she needed human contact. The isolation was beginning to affect her judgment, and she found herself talking to the coffee machine earlier that morning. The descent into the subway system felt like entering a tomb. Emergency lighting cast ghostly shadows on the walls, and her footsteps echoed in the darkness. Every sound made her freeze, listening for the telltale groaning and shuffling that signaled infected presence. She had learned that they were drawn to noise and movement, but in darkness, they seemed less active, almost dormant. 20 minutes of careful navigation through service tunnels brought her to Millennium Park. Nix Ravencroft stood waiting at the entrance to the parking structure, a tall woman with steel-gray eyes and close-cropped auburn hair, wearing tactical gear that had seen recent combat. Her right arm was in a makeshift sling, and dried blood stained her jacket. "Dr. Caldwell, I presume," Nix said, extending her left hand. "Welcome to what might be the last functioning outpost of sanity in Chicago." The underground parking garage had been transformed into a fortress. Vehicles were arranged to create barriers and lookout points, solar panels jerry-rigged to car batteries provided power, and makeshift sleeping areas were sectioned off with hanging tarps. Most importantly, Zephyr could see other survivors, a grizzled man with a crossbow examining arrows, a young woman operating a ham radio, and an older gentleman in a torn suit pacing while reading from a thick folder. "How many of you are there?" Zephyr asked, setting down her equipment. 7, including you now," Nix replied. "That's Orion Blackthorn, he was a wilderness survival instructor before this mess started. Kept us fed and taught us how to move quietly. Serafina Voss over there has been monitoring emergency frequencies and trying to contact other survivor groups. And that's Thaddeus Grimm, former FEMA coordinator. He's been analyzing evacuation reports and trying to piece together how the outbreak spread so quickly." Zephyr studied each face, seeing the same haunted expression she recognized in her own reflection, the look of people who had witnessed the collapse of everything they thought they understood about the world. Yet there was also determination, a refusal to surrender to the chaos consuming their country. "What do we know about the spread pattern?" she asked, pulling out her research notes. Thaddeus looked up from his files, his weathered face grim. "Best estimates suggest patient 0 was somewhere on the East Coast, probably New York or Boston. The infection spread along major transportation corridors, highways, airports, rail lines. But the incubation period varies wildly. Some people turned within hours, others took days. Some seemed immune initially but succumbed after repeated exposure. Zephyr felt a chill run down her spine. That suggests the pathogen is evolving, adapting to overcome human immune responses. If it continues to mutate at this rate. She trailed off, unwilling to voice the terrifying conclusion. Then we need to find answers fast, Nix finished. Because from what we're seeing on the radio chatter, Chicago isn't the only city that's fallen. This thing is spreading across the entire nation, and if we don't figure out how to stop it, there won't be an America left to save. The morning brought grim news over Serafina's radio equipment. Her pale fingers danced across the frequency dial while her violet eyes reflected the gravity of each transmission she intercepted. Reports crackled through from surviving military units, isolated civilians, and emergency responders scattered across the continent. Detroit had gone dark 48 hours ago. Philadelphia was reporting 90% casualty rates. Even rural areas weren't safe. The infection was spreading along interstate highways like wildfire through dry grass. Denver's still holding, Serafina reported to the group gathered around her radio station. They've established a perimeter around the city center, but they're requesting medical expertise. Something about the infected exhibiting new behaviors. She pushed a strand of dark purple hair behind her ear, a nervous habit she'd developed since the outbreak began. Before the plague, she had been a sound engineer for a local radio station, but her technical skills had proven invaluable in their current situation. Zephyr looked up from the microscope she'd been hunched over for the past 3 hours, studying tissue samples she'd collected from an infected corpse Orion had eliminated during a supply run. New behaviors? What kind? They're coordinating, Thaddeus interjected, setting down a cup of coffee that smelled better than it had any right to in their circumstances. I've been cross-referencing the reports. In multiple locations, survivors described the infected moving in organized groups, setting up what looked like ambushes, even using simple tools. The implications sent a chill through the garage. Mindless zombies were terrifying enough, but the possibility of intelligent infected was a nightmare scenario none of them wanted to contemplate. Orion Blackthorn emerged from behind one of the vehicle barriers, his weathered face bearing fresh scratches from his latest reconnaissance mission. The man moved with the silent grace of someone who had spent decades in the wilderness, and his knowledge of urban survival had kept them alive when military training and scientific expertise had fallen short. "We've got a problem," he announced, checking the arrows in his quiver. "The infected are massing about 6 blocks north. I counted at least 200, and they're not just wandering around. They're gathered in the old concert venue, and it looks like they're waiting for something." Nick stood up from the tactical map she'd been updating with red markers indicating confirmed infected zones. Her injured arm was healing, but she favored it unconsciously as she moved. "Waiting for what?" "That's what worries me," Orion replied. "I've never seen them behave like this. Usually, they spread out searching for food, but this group seems to be organizing. And there's something else. I found evidence of other survivor groups in the area, but their camps are empty. No signs of struggle, no bodies. It's like they just left." Lysander Cross looked up from the engine he'd been modifying in the corner of their makeshift workshop. The young man had an intuitive understanding of machinery that had proven invaluable in maintaining their vehicles and power systems. His dark skin was streaked with grease, and his amber eyes held an intelligence that belied his 22 years. "Maybe they had the right idea," he said quietly. "If the infected are evolving, becoming more organized, then staying in one place might be a death sentence." The group fell silent, each member lost in their own thoughts about the implications. They had worked hard to establish their sanctuary, but survival might require abandoning everything they'd built. "There's something else," Zephyr said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been analyzing the tissue samples, and I'm seeing cellular structures that shouldn't exist. The infected aren't just reanimated corpses, they're something new. The pathogen isn't just killing and reanimating tissue, it's reorganizing it, creating new neural pathways, new forms of biological communication. Serafina's radio suddenly burst to life with a transmission that made everyone freeze. The voice was distorted, barely human, but the words were unmistakably clear: "Survivors, in the underground, we know you're there, join us, or be consumed." The silence that followed was deafening. For 30 seconds, nobody moved, nobody breathed. Then Orion was checking his weapons, Nyx was studying defensive positions, and Thaddeus was gathering his emergency files. "They know we're here," Nyx stated, her military training taking over. "We need to move, now. Grab essential supplies only, weapons, medical equipment, food for 3 days maximum." As the group scrambled to pack, Zephyr made a decision that would haunt her. She couldn't carry all her research equipment, but she managed to save her most important samples and data on a portable drive. If they were going to find a cure or solution to the plague, she needed to preserve every scrap of information about the pathogen's behavior and evolution. Lysander had their vehicles running within minutes, their engines modified to run more quietly than standard models. The plan was simple: use the underground tunnel system to reach the outskirts of the city, then decide on their next destination based on radio intelligence. As they prepared to leave their sanctuary, each member of the group understood that they were embarking on a journey with no guaranteed destination. America was dying around them, transformed into something unrecognizable, and they might be among the last people capable of finding a way to reverse the catastrophe. The weight of that responsibility settled on their shoulders as they loaded their supplies and prepared to venture back into the infected world above. The last thing Serafina did before leaving was broadcast their location and intended route to any other survivors who might be listening. It was a risk. The infected had demonstrated they could monitor communications, but abandoning other survivors to save themselves felt like another form of death. The journey through Chicago's underground maze lasted 14 hours before disaster struck. They had made good progress through maintenance tunnels and abandoned subway lines, guided by Orion's uncanny ability to navigate in darkness and Lysander's mechanical expertise in keeping their modified vehicles running silently. The infected seemed less active in the subterranean environment, though they occasionally heard distant groaning echoing through connected passages. Cordelia Ashe had joined their group during the escape, a trauma surgeon they'd rescued from Northwestern Memorial Hospital where she'd been trapped in an operating room for 5 days. Her surgical skills and medical knowledge complemented Zephyr's research expertise, but her hands still trembled slightly from the psychological trauma of watching her colleagues and patients transform into monsters. She had short-cropped blonde hair and piercing green eyes that had seen too much suffering in recent days. "Movement ahead," whispered Fenris Vale, their newest member and self-appointed scout. The lean man with distinctive silver-streaked black hair had found them 6 hours earlier, claiming to have escaped from a fallen military outpost near Lake Michigan. His knowledge of the infected's behavioral patterns had already proven valuable, but there was something about his manner that made some group members uneasy. They were traveling through what had once been the Chicago Pedway system, a network of underground walkways connecting downtown buildings. The passages were narrow, forcing them to move single file, and the emergency lighting had failed in most sections. Orion led with his crossbow ready, followed by Nyx with her military-issue sidearm, then the others with Fenris bringing up the rear. The attack came without warning. What they had mistaken for scattered debris in a wider junction was actually a group of infected lying dormant in the darkness. As their flashlight beams swept across the area, dozens of eyes reflected the light, and the creatures rose with horrifying coordination. "Ambush!" Nyx shouted, opening fire on the nearest infected. Her shots were precise, but there were too many of them, and they moved with purpose rather than the mindless shuffling the group had grown accustomed to. Orion's crossbow bolts found their targets with deadly accuracy, but for every infected he dropped, 2 more seemed to emerge from the shadows. These weren't the slow, decaying zombies they'd encountered before. These moved with frightening speed and seemed to communicate through low-frequency sounds that felt more than heard. Cordelia screamed as one of the infected grabbed her medical bag, not to attack her but to examine its contents with disturbing intelligence. The creature's rotting fingers manipulated the surgical instruments with an almost curious manner before letting out a keening wail that summoned more of its kind. "They're learning," Zephyr gasped as she witnessed infected using debris as makeshift weapons and tools. "The pathogen is evolving their cognitive functions. They're not just hungry, they're intelligent." The battle lasted only minutes, but the cost was devastating. Thaddeus Grimm fell defending their rear flank, pulled down by 3 infected who seemed to specifically target him rather than attacking at random. His last act was to throw his research files to Serafina, shouting something about pattern recognition before his voice was cut short. Lysander suffered a deep gash across his forearm during the escape, and while Cordelia managed to treat the wound, they all knew that any exposure to infected bodily fluids carried the risk of transmission. The young mechanic insisted he felt fine, but everyone watched him carefully for signs of fever or behavioral changes. They eventually reached a maintenance chamber where they could catch their breath and tend to their wounds. The loss of Thaddeus hit the group hard, not just because he had been a friend and valuable team member, but because his death demonstrated that their sanctuary mentality was obsolete. The infected were hunting them specifically, tracking them with purpose and intelligence. "We can't keep running randomly," Nick said, checking her ammunition supply with grim efficiency. "They're anticipating our movements, setting up ambushes. We need a destination, a plan beyond simple survival." Fenris had been unusually quiet since the attack, studying the infected behavior patterns with an intensity that made Orion suspicious. "There's something they want," he finally said. "They're not just trying to kill us or infect us. They were examining our equipment, our supplies. It's like they're looking for something specific." Zephyr pulled out her portable testing equipment and began analyzing blood samples from the fight scene. What she discovered made her stomach turn. The pathogen has evolved again. It's not just reanimating dead tissue anymore, it's creating new neural networks, new forms of biological communication. The infected are becoming something like a collective intelligence. Serafina managed to establish radio contact with the Denver survivors while the others discussed their options. The news was worse than they feared. Cities across the nation were reporting similar evolutionary changes in the infected populations. But there was also a glimmer of hope, reports of isolated areas where the infection seemed to have stopped spreading, where small populations had achieved some form of stability. "Montana," Serafina reported. "There's a research facility in the mountains, some kind of government black site. They're claiming to have developed countermeasures, possibly even a cure. But they're only accepting people with specific expertise, medical professionals, researchers, military personnel." The group looked at each other, realizing they might represent exactly the kind of skilled individuals the facility was seeking. But reaching Montana from Chicago would require traveling through hundreds of miles of infected territory, and they had just learned that their enemies were far more dangerous than they had imagined. As they prepared to leave the maintenance chamber, Lysander checked his wound again. The bandage was clean, no signs of infection, but something in his amber eyes had changed, a distant look that made Cordelia exchange worried glances with Zephyr. The plague was evolving, and they couldn't be certain that any of them were truly safe from its influence. The discovery came 3 days later in the ruins of what had been Northwestern University's medical research complex. Zephyr and Cordelia had insisted on investigating the facility despite the obvious risks, hoping to find equipment or research data that might prove useful. What they found instead changed everything they thought they knew about the plague. Hidden in a sub-basement laboratory that had somehow escaped the infected's attention, they discovered the work of Dr. Evelyn Blackwood, a molecular biologist who had been studying prion diseases before the outbreak. Her research notes, meticulously preserved in sealed containers, told a story that made Zephyr's blood run cold. She was working on something called Project Lazarus, Zephyr explained to the group as they gathered around her portable computer screen in an abandoned parking structure. It was supposed to be a breakthrough in treating degenerative brain diseases, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's. The idea was to use modified prion to rebuild damaged neural pathways. Cordelia leaned closer, her medical training helping her understand the implications. But prion are incredibly dangerous. They're essentially malformed proteins that can corrupt normal proteins in a chain reaction. If someone was experimenting with modified prion, they could have created exactly what we're seeing, Zephyr finished. A pathogen that doesn't just kill cells, it rewrites them, reorganizes neural structures, creates new forms of biological communication. Orion cleaned his crossbow methodically while listening, his weathered face troubled. You're saying this thing was man-made? Someone created this plague on purpose? The research notes painted a more complex picture. Dr. Blackwood's work had been funded through a series of shell companies ultimately traced back to military biodefense contracts. The goal had been defensive, understanding how to counter biological weapons that might target human cognition. But somewhere in the research process, something had gone catastrophically wrong. Fenris studied the documents with particular intensity, his silver-streaked hair falling across his face as he read. Look at these dates, he said, pointing to a series of entries. She was documenting problems with containment protocols 3 weeks before the first reported cases. Someone knew this was happening and didn't stop it. Lysander's condition had been deteriorating slowly but noticeably. His wound had healed cleanly, showing no signs of conventional infection, but his behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. He would stand motionless for long periods, his amber eyes unfocused, as if listening to something the others couldn't hear. When questioned, he insisted he felt fine, but Cordelia had documented subtle changes in his vital signs and reflexes. There's more, Zephyr continued, scrolling through the digital files. Dr. Blackwood believed she had developed a potential countermeasure, something she called a neural reset protocol. It's based on introducing competing prion structures that could theoretically interrupt the pathogen's reorganization process. Serafina had been monitoring radio communications from their mobile setup, and her reports grew more disturbing by the day. The organized infected behavior they'd witnessed in Chicago was spreading nationwide. Military units reported encounters with infected that used tactics, set traps, and even operated simple machinery. More chilling were accounts of infected attempting to communicate with humans, trying to convince them to surrender voluntarily. The facility in Montana is still transmitting, Serafina reported, adjusting her equipment to filter out static. But they're being more selective about who they're accepting. They're specifically requesting anyone with knowledge of prion research or biodefense protocols. Nick studied their map, calculating distances and supply requirements. It's 1,000 miles through infected territory. We'll need to resupply at least twice, and there's no guarantee we'll find safe shelter along the way. The decision was complicated by growing suspicions about Fenris. Several group members had noticed inconsistencies in his story about escaping the military outpost, and his knowledge of infected behavior patterns seemed unusually detailed. Orion had begun watching him carefully, noting how the man seemed to anticipate infected movements almost before they happened. We need to discuss something, Cordelia said quietly, pulling Zephyr and Nyx aside. I've been observing Lysander's condition, and I'm seeing neurological changes that match some of the early descriptions in Blackwood's research. His pupil responses are altered, his reflexes are changing, and yesterday I caught him responding to sounds none of the rest of us could hear. The implications were terrifying. If Lysander was showing early signs of infection despite having no obvious exposure, it suggested the pathogen could spread through vectors they didn't understand, airborne transmission, contaminated surfaces, or even some form of electromagnetic communication between infected individuals. There's something else, Nyx added. I've been tracking our route on the military frequencies, and infected groups seem to know where we're going before we get there. Either they're more intelligent than we realized, or someone is feeding them information about our movements. As if summoned by their conversation, Lysander appeared from behind their vehicle barricade, his amber eyes reflecting the dim light in an unusual way. I can hear them, he said softly. They're not monsters. They're trying to save us from something worse. The change isn't death, it's evolution. Cordelia reached for her medical bag, but Lysander raised his hand peacefully. I'm still me, he insisted. But I can feel it happening, the connections forming. Dr. Blackwood was wrong about one thing, this isn't a disease. It's an upgrade. Humanity can't survive what's coming in our current form. The group faced an impossible choice. Lysander was clearly infected, but he retained his personality and memories. If his condition represented the pathogen's true nature rather than a malfunction, everything they thought they knew about the plague might be wrong. And if Fenris was somehow connected to their pursuers, their journey to Montana might be leading them directly into a trap. That night, as they prepared for the dangerous journey ahead, each member of the group wondered if they were fighting to save humanity or simply delaying an inevitable transformation that might be necessary for survival in a world that had already fundamentally changed. The journey to Montana began at dawn with the discovery that Fenris had vanished during the night, taking with him detailed maps of their planned route and the portable radio equipment they used to monitor infected communications. Orion found signs of a struggle near the perimeter, but no blood, no body, just disturbed earth and the unsettling impression that their supposed ally had left willingly. He was never one of us, Nyx concluded grimly as she checked their remaining supplies. The timing of his appearance, his knowledge of infected behavior, the way he always seemed to know what they were thinking, he was either infected himself or working with them. Lysander's condition continued to evolve, presenting the group with an ethical dilemma that threatened to tear them apart. His cognitive abilities remained intact, even enhanced in some ways, but his physical appearance was beginning to change. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, his reflexes had become unnaturally quick, and most disturbing of all, he demonstrated an uncanny ability to predict infected movements and behavior. I can feel the network, he explained as they traveled through abandoned farmland in southern Illinois. It's not malicious, it's trying to preserve consciousness, to create something that can survive what's coming. The infected aren't mindless. They're connected, sharing thoughts and experiences across vast distances. Cordelia monitored his vital signs obsessively, documenting changes that defied medical explanation. His heart rate had slowed significantly, his body temperature had dropped several degrees, and brain scans using portable equipment showed neural activity patterns unlike anything in medical literature. Yet he remained articulate, caring, recognizably himself. "What's coming?" Zephyr asked, though she dreaded the answer. What is the pathogen preparing humanity for? Lysander's amber eyes had developed flecks of silver that seemed to shift and move when he was concentrating. Environmental collapse, he said quietly. The data is all there in the research networks. Climate change, resource depletion, ecological breakdown, baseline humanity won't survive the next century. The pathogen is an adaptation mechanism, a way to create a species that can thrive in the world we've created. The revelation forced them to confront uncomfortable questions about their mission. If Lysander was correct, if the plague represented evolution rather than extinction, were they fighting to preserve a doomed species? But even if the pathogen's ultimate purpose was beneficial, the transformation process had killed billions and destroyed civilization. The cure might be worse than the disease. Serafina had managed to maintain radio contact with various survivor groups using equipment salvaged from abandoned relay stations. The reports painted a picture of a continent in complete collapse. Major cities were either completely overrun or defended by increasingly desperate military forces. Rural areas offered no safety, infected populations had spread along every highway and river system, creating an interconnected network that spanned the entire continent. The Montana facility is still transmitting, she reported during a rest stop in what had been Springfield, Illinois. But their messages are changing. They're no longer just requesting specialists, they're claiming to have made contact with infected leadership. They say negotiations are underway for some kind of coexistence protocol. The idea of negotiating with infected populations struck most of the group as absurd, but Lysander nodded thoughtfully. It makes sense, he said. The network is trying to minimize casualties during the transition. If they can convert key populations peacefully, it reduces trauma and preserves more human knowledge and culture. Their route took them through increasingly dangerous territory. The infected had learned to use infrastructure against survivors, disabling bridges, blocking highways, even manipulating traffic signals in areas where power remained active. Orion's wilderness skills became crucial as they were forced to travel cross-country, avoiding roads and population centers. The most disturbing development was evidence of infected manufacturing capabilities. They discovered abandoned factories that had been converted to produce new types of equipment, devices that resembled communication arrays, processing facilities for converting organic matter into unknown substances, and what appeared to be incubation chambers for some kind of biological cultivation. "They're not just surviving," Cordelia observed as they studied one of these facilities from a distance. "They're building something." This level of organization and technological adaptation suggests the pathogen doesn't just preserve intelligence, it enhances it. During their third week of travel, they encountered their first organized infected settlement. From a hilltop overlooking what had been the town of Hannibal, Missouri, they watched hundreds of infected individuals engaged in clearly purposeful activities. They were farming, constructing buildings, and operating machinery with efficiency that surpassed many human communities. "Look at them," Zephyr whispered, adjusting her binoculars. "They're not mindless monsters. They're a functioning society." Lysander stood at the edge of their observation post, his transformed features reflecting a longing that worried his companions. "They're calling to me," he admitted. "Not to join them physically, but to connect with the network, to share what we've learned about the cure research. They want to understand it, to incorporate it into their evolution." The group faced a crucial decision. Lysander's condition made him a valuable asset for understanding infected behavior, but his growing connection to the network made him a potential security risk. More importantly, his transformation raised questions about the nature of their mission. If the infected represented humanity's future rather than its destruction, what exactly were they trying to save? As they prepared for the final push toward Montana, each member of the group carried their own doubts about whether they were heroes on a rescue mission or the last representatives of a species clinging to obsolescence. The research facility in the mountains promised answers, but increasingly, they wondered if those answers would be ones they wanted to hear. The infected settlement below continued its activities as night fell, their coordinated movements illuminated by bioluminescent markers that had definitely not existed in baseline human technology. Whatever humanity was becoming, it was something entirely new, and the old rules of survival might no longer apply. The ambush came as they crossed into Montana, just as hope was beginning to replace desperation in their conversations. They had been following abandoned railroad tracks through mountain passes, believing the difficult terrain would provide safety from large infected groups. Instead, they walked directly into the most sophisticated trap they had yet encountered. The infected had modified the landscape itself. What appeared to be natural rockfall blocking the tracks was actually carefully positioned debris designed to channel travelers into a narrow canyon where escape would be impossible. Motion sensors salvaged from military equipment triggered when the group approached, and the trap closed with mechanical precision. "They're using our own technology against us," Nix observed grimly as infected figures emerged from concealed positions with what were clearly military weapons and equipment. These weren't the shambling zombies from the early days of the outbreak, they moved with tactical awareness and carried themselves like trained soldiers. The leader of the infected group was immediately recognizable despite his transformation. Fenris Vale stepped into view, his silver-streaked hair now completely white, his skin bearing the characteristic grayish pallor of the infected, but his eyes retained intelligence and purpose. Most disturbing of all, he wore the uniform of the Montana research facility they had been trying to reach. "Hello, old friends," Fenris said, his voice carrying harmonic undertones that seemed to resonate in their bones. "I apologize for the deception, but it was necessary to guide you here safely. The direct route to the facility is heavily contested by uninfected military forces who shoot first and ask questions never." Lysander stepped forward, his own transformation now advanced enough that he could communicate with the infected through methods the others couldn't perceive. The conversation that followed was conducted partly through spoken words and partly through the low-frequency harmonics that served as the infected's primary communication method. "He says the research facility has been compromised," Lysander translated. "The military tried to weaponize Dr. Blackwood's cure research, to create something that would not just stop the infection but reverse it violently. The process would kill anyone who had been exposed to the pathogen, even if they hadn't fully transformed." Cordelia checked her medical supplies, knowing they were inadequate for any kind of major conflict. How many people would that affect? How widespread is exposure to the pathogen? Fenris answered directly, his transformed vocal cords producing the strange harmonic speech patterns. "Everyone," he said. "The pathogen is airborne in dormant form. Every person on the continent has been exposed. The only reason some haven't transformed is that their individual biology is resistant to activation. The military's cure would cause cellular breakdown in 90% of the human population." The revelation hit the group like a physical blow. They had been thinking in terms of infected versus uninfected, but the reality was that nearly everyone was infected, just at different stages of development. The cure they had been seeking would be genocide on an unimaginable scale. "The network has been trying to minimize casualties," Fenris continued. "The violent transformations in major cities were the result of panic and resistance. When people accept the change willingly, the process is peaceful, preserving personality and memories while enhancing physical and cognitive capabilities." Zephyr struggled to process the implications of what she was hearing. But the research data, Dr. Blackwood's work, she believed the neural reset protocol could interrupt the pathogen's influence. "It can," Lysander confirmed, his amber eyes now predominantly silver. "But interruption isn't reversal. The reset protocol would essentially lobotomize anyone who had been exposed, reducing them to a vegetative state. The military leadership knows this, but they see it as preferable to losing control of the human species." Serafina had been monitoring her portable radio equipment throughout the conversation, and her face had grown increasingly pale. "I'm picking up military transmissions," she reported. "There's a bomber squadron en route to this area. They're planning to carpet bomb the entire region, infected and uninfected alike." The group found themselves facing an impossible choice. They could continue to the research facility and likely be killed by military forces who viewed them as contaminated. They could surrender to the infected network and undergo transformation, preserving their consciousness but losing their humanity. Or they could try to escape the coming bombardment and continue their desperate flight across a continent where survival seemed increasingly unlikely. "There's a fourth option," Fenris said, as if reading their thoughts. "The network has developed its own research capabilities. We've been working on a true synthesis, a form of the pathogen that preserves human consciousness and emotional capacity while providing enhanced survival abilities. It's not the violent transformation that created the crisis, and it's not the deadly cure the military is pursuing." Orion had remained silent throughout the conversation, but now he spoke with quiet intensity. "What you're describing isn't human anymore, no matter how you package it. If we accept this transformation, we're agreeing to the extinction of our species." "Your species is already extinct," Fenris replied gently. "The environmental pressures that triggered the pathogen's emergence haven't disappeared. Climate change, resource depletion, ecological collapse, baseline humanity cannot survive what's coming. The network represents adaptation, not extinction." As if to emphasize his point, the distant sound of aircraft engines began to echo through the mountain passes. The military bombardment was approaching, and they had minutes to decide between transformation, death, or a desperate attempt at escape that would likely result in both. Lysander looked at each of his companions, his transformed features reflecting sadness and determination. "I can guide you to safety," he said. "The network has established underground shelters that can withstand conventional bombing. But entering them means accepting the transformation. There's no going back to what we were." The choice that would determine the fate of the last uninfected humans in their region came down to a single question: was survival worth the cost of fundamental change, or were some things more important than living? The bombs began falling as Cordelia made her decision. She had spent her career saving lives, and watching billions die while clinging to species purity felt like the ultimate betrayal of her medical oath. As explosions shattered the mountain passes around them, she stepped forward and placed her hand on Lysander's shoulder. "Do it," she said simply. "Whatever this transformation offers, it has to be better than extinction." The underground shelter was a marvel of biological engineering that defied everything they thought they knew about infected capabilities. Carved from living rock that seemed to pulse with its own metabolism, the facility housed thousands of transformed individuals engaged in activities that represented a fusion of human culture and post-human capability. Art, music, scientific research, and social interaction continued, but enhanced by the cognitive networking that allowed direct sharing of thoughts and experiences. Serafina was the second to choose transformation, her decision motivated by the realization that her radio expertise could be amplified through the network to establish communication with survivor groups worldwide. "If we're going to preserve anything of human civilization," she reasoned, "we need to reach other people before the military destroys them." The transformation process itself was nothing like the violent changes they had witnessed during the plague's early stages. Working with enhanced medical knowledge from the network, infected physicians had developed protocols that preserved individual consciousness while gradually integrating new capabilities. Cordelia and Serafina underwent the process together, their hands interlinked as their nervous systems were slowly rewritten. Zephyr watched her colleagues' transformation with scientific fascination and personal horror. Their skin gradually acquired the characteristic grayish pallor, their eyes developed the distinctive silver flecks that indicated network connectivity, and their movements became preternaturally graceful. But their personalities remained intact, they were still recognizably themselves, just enhanced. "The networking isn't mind control," Cordelia explained after her transformation was complete, her voice carrying the new harmonic undertones. "I can still think independently, make my own decisions, feel my own emotions. But I also have access to the accumulated knowledge and experience of the entire network. It's like having the internet directly connected to your consciousness." Orion and Nyx represented the holdouts, their military training making them suspicious of any change that might compromise their individual autonomy. But as reports came in from the surface about the extent of the military bombardment, they faced the reality that their old world was being systematically destroyed by the very people who claimed to be saving it. 90% of survivor settlements in this region have been eliminated, Serafina reported, her enhanced abilities allowing her to monitor communications across unprecedented distances. "The military is treating anyone who hasn't reached designated evacuation centers as infected and therefore expendable." Zephyr found herself in the most difficult position. Her scientific training made her appreciate the biological elegance of the pathogen's evolutionary solution, but her emotional attachment to baseline humanity made her resistant to accepting transformation. She spent hours in the facility's research areas, studying the modified pathogen strains that the network had developed. "They've solved the major problems," she admitted to Nyx during one of their private conversations. "The modified pathogen preserves individual consciousness, maintains emotional capacity, and provides enhanced physical and cognitive abilities. From a purely objective standpoint, it represents an improvement over baseline human biology." The decision was ultimately forced by external circumstances. A military assault team had located the facility's entrance and was preparing to use chemical weapons that would kill everyone inside, transformed or not. The network's defensive capabilities were formidable, but they were designed to minimize casualties rather than inflict them. Against an enemy determined to commit genocide, pacifist philosophy became a fatal weakness. "They're not giving us a choice," Nyx realized as infected scouts reported military positions surrounding the facility. "It's transformation or death, and death doesn't serve anyone." The final transformation ceremony took place in the facility's central chamber, a vast space that seemed to pulse with bioluminescent life. Orion, Nyx, and Zephyr stood together as the network's medical specialists prepared the modified pathogen strains. Each strain was customized to their individual biology, designed to preserve their unique skills and personalities while integrating them into the larger collective. As the transformation began, Zephyr felt her consciousness expanding in ways that transcended physical sensation. She remained herself, her memories, her personality, her scientific curiosity, but she also became connected to a vast network of minds working together to solve problems that no individual could comprehend. The climate crisis, resource depletion, ecological collapse, challenges that had seemed insurmountable to individual humans became manageable when approached by a collective intelligence. "We're not losing our humanity," she realized as the transformation completed. "We're becoming more human than we ever were before." All the cooperation, creativity, and compassion that made us special, but without the limitations that were driving us to extinction. The military assault began just as the last of their group completed transformation. But instead of defending the facility through violence, the network chose a different approach. Using their enhanced communication abilities, they broadcast directly to the attacking soldiers' minds, sharing the truth about what the transformation actually represented. The effect was profound. Faced with evidence that the infected retained their humanity while gaining abilities necessary for long-term survival, many of the soldiers chose to lay down their weapons and request transformation themselves. Others retreated to report to their commanders, carrying with them seeds of doubt about the mission they had been given. As dawn broke over the Montana mountains, the last confirmed group of uninfected humans in the region had made their choice. They were no longer what they had been, but they were still themselves, enhanced, connected, and perhaps finally capable of building a sustainable future for the consciousness that had once called itself human. The war between infected and uninfected was ending, not through violence, but through the gradual recognition that transformation represented hope rather than extinction. But the true test would come in the months ahead, as the enhanced human network faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding civilization while healing a devastated planet. 6 months after the transformation, Zephyr stood on what had once been the observation deck of the Chicago Willis Tower, now converted into a biological monitoring station that pulsed with living technology. The city below bore little resemblance to the urban landscape she remembered. Green corridors of engineered vegetation wound between buildings that had been modified to function as part of a vast ecological system, and the air itself felt cleaner, charged with the subtle electromagnetic signatures of the network's communication web. The integration had not been without cost. While the enhanced pathogen preserved individual consciousness, the networking effect meant that privacy as humans had understood it no longer existed. Every thought, every emotion, every memory was potentially accessible to the collective, moderated only by social protocols that the network had developed organically. For someone like Zephyr, whose scientific mind had always valued objective analysis, the adjustment had been profound but manageable. For others, the psychological impact had been devastating. "We've lost approximately 30% of the transformed population to what we're calling integration syndrome," Cordelia reported during their weekly assessment meeting. Her enhanced medical capabilities allowed her to monitor the mental health of thousands of individuals simultaneously, but the emotional toll of experiencing so much suffering through the network connection was evident in her expression. The human psyche wasn't designed for collective consciousness. Some people simply cannot maintain individual identity while connected to the whole. The syndrome manifested differently in different individuals. Some lost themselves entirely, becoming essentially vacant shells animated by the network's collective will. Others experienced psychological fragmentation, their personalities splitting into multiple aspects that could not reconcile with each other. A few rare cases developed what could only be described as enhanced autism, complete withdrawal from the network while retaining their enhanced physical capabilities. Serafina had become the network's primary communication coordinator, her enhanced abilities allowing her to maintain contact with transformed communities across the globe. The reports she gathered painted a picture of a world in dramatic transition. "We're seeing similar patterns everywhere," she noted, her consciousness simultaneously processing hundreds of conversations in dozens of languages. The transformation is succeeding from a biological standpoint, but the psychological adaptation is taking longer than anyone anticipated. The untransformed human population had largely retreated to heavily defended enclaves in remote areas, military bases, isolated research facilities, and underground bunkers where they continued to work on weapons designed to destroy the network. From their perspective, the enhanced humans represented an existential threat to human consciousness itself, regardless of the peaceful intentions of the transformed. "They're not entirely wrong," Nyx admitted during a private moment when she had temporarily disconnected from the network's communication channels. Her military background made her uniquely qualified to understand the strategic implications of their situation. "We've gained incredible capabilities, but we've also lost something essential about what made us human. The question is whether what we've gained is worth what we've lost." Orion had adapted to the transformation better than expected, his wilderness survival skills translating well to the network's biological approach to problem solving. He spent most of his time in the field, helping to establish new communities and teaching survival techniques to recently transformed populations. But even he acknowledged the profound changes in human behavior and motivation. "We don't compete anymore," he observed. "Not the way we used to." Competition was wasteful, but it was also what drove innovation and achievement. "The network optimizes for efficiency and sustainability, but I'm not sure it optimizes for the kind of individual excellence that created the best of human culture." Lysander had become something of a bridge figure between the transformed and untransformed populations. His early transformation and gradual adaptation made him uniquely qualified to understand both perspectives, and he spent much of his time attempting to negotiate with holdout communities. The results were mixed. Some groups were willing to consider peaceful coexistence, while others viewed any communication with the network as contamination. "They fear us because they don't understand us," he explained during one of his reports from the field. "But we don't fully understand ourselves either. We're something new, something that has never existed before. The learning curve is steep for everyone involved." The environmental recovery had been dramatic and encouraging. The network's enhanced understanding of ecological systems allowed for rapid restoration of damaged ecosystems, and their reduced resource consumption meant that pressure on the planet's carrying capacity had decreased significantly. But the cultural implications were more complex. Human art, literature, and music continued to exist within the network, but transformed by the collective consciousness experience. Individual creativity remained, but it was now influenced by the direct input of thousands of other minds. The result was art that was more complex and sophisticated than anything humans had created before, but also fundamentally alien to pre-transformation sensibilities. "We're preserving human culture," Zephyr reflected as she analyzed cultural transmission patterns within the network. "But we're also changing it in ways that make it unrecognizable to what we used to be. The question is whether preservation requires maintaining the exact same forms, or whether evolution and adaptation are acceptable as long as the core essence is maintained." The most difficult challenge was dealing with children. The pathogen affected developing nervous systems differently than mature ones, and children who underwent transformation often developed capabilities that surpassed even enhanced adults. But they also showed less attachment to pre-transformation human culture and values, viewing the untransformed as a separate species rather than as former kin. As the sun set over the transformed Chicago skyline, Zephyr felt the familiar pulse of the network's collective consciousness washing through her awareness. Millions of minds working together to solve problems, share experiences, and build something unprecedented in the history of consciousness itself. The old world was gone forever, and what they had built in its place was still evolving. The experiment in enhanced humanity would continue, driven by necessity rather than choice. Whether it represented salvation or extinction for human consciousness remained an open question, one that might not be answered for generations. But for now, they survived, they grew, and they changed, no longer human as the species had once defined itself, but not yet certain what they were becoming. In the distance, hidden in the mountains beyond the city, the last untransformed humans continued their desperate research into weapons that might restore their version of humanity. The war was far from over, but its nature had fundamentally changed. It was no longer a battle between the living and the dead, but between different visions of what consciousness itself should become in a universe that demanded adaptation or extinction. The choice had been made, but its consequences would echo through centuries yet to come.